Energy is a funny area because there's only one thing that's really important, and that is are you buying renewable energy? Yeah. Yes, no. And then
get that scope 2 down.
And then it gets a little bit more complicated because some things that you purchase energy for are very complex to deliver with renewable energy sources. A factory in a very water scarce area had initiated rainwater collection, which would normally, I would say, this indicates a very high level of maturity on water and water efficiency. But what it also showed was that this was an initiative that came out of a necessity because they were really short on water. So they would need to have their own supply. So it was also a responsible strategy business-wise because it made them more resilient.
Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast, the podcast where we give you knowledge and tips and strategies for how to become a sustainable pharma company, medtech company, hospital or healthcare system. And we have a really, really good episode for you today. My co-founder and partner in the company, Frederik, is coming in to talk about a project we did with a client on how to make a part of their factory mass circular, so pharmaceutical company. So we dive really, really deep into how do you bridge the gap between having high-level sustainability goals to actually creating a model that can say, where are we, what do we need to do to get further, and what are the priorities. And we also dive into some deep examples within wastewater and energy. Really enjoyed doing the episode. As always, really, really happy that people are listening out there. Would really appreciate a 5-star review. So go and do that if you haven't done it. And remember to also go back and listen to some of the other episodes. Enjoy the episode. Hi, Frederik.
Hi, Joachim.
Great to be here with you as always in the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast.
Thank you. Really good to be here.
I'm quite excited about today because today we're going to talk about two things I find very important and absolutely fascinating. One thing is the circular economy and how to get it into factories, with pharma factories, medtech factories. And the other thing is that we'll be doing it through a case with an undisclosed client of ours. And I'm just always really excited about the projects that we're doing. And I think we'll get some very real world examples in this episode as well of how to implement circularity and get the green transition.
Yeah, that's the point.
That is exactly the point. So perhaps if you could take it from the big top first, why is circularity even necessary in pharma and medtech production?
Yeah, so as a famous Danish politician once said, the ice is melting at the poles, which is to say that global warming and climate change is quite real. And we are right now very much on a trajectory where the climate catastrophe will happen if we don't manage to curb the greenhouse gas emissions. So circular economy is one of the many tools that we have in our toolbox that can help address this problem. And many of our clients, they come to us with questions about how might we reduce our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which is a way to map what greenhouse gas emissions do we have as a company. And there the circular economy is a really good way to look at the economic system and figure out how can we do things in a business way that is not as harmful to the environment. So that's where the circular economy is really also a way of looking at economic growth, but at the same time recognizing that we have limited planetary resources. And sort of that's not part of the linear economy where we sort of have the current growth paradigm is that we can just keep on growing and growing and growing without looking to the scarcity of resources, without looking at the planetary limitations. So that's a very brief introduction to, to why it's important.
And circular economy is perhaps even more important when we go beyond CO2 emissions into some of the other planetary boundaries of finite fresh water or rare minerals and metals and so on. Yes. Amazing. Yeah. So what was the setup of the project, and what was the problem that
so that's it's really what if this was a football match, we would be looking at a corner kick. So the situation is the corporate entity has a sustainability strategy. They have a lot of fragmented plans for integrating sustainability here and there, but they do not have a coherent plan. That's something we see quite often, that there is an execution gap between the sustainability strategy at the large level and then at the manufacturing plant at the ground level. So what we were tasked with here was to build a coherent model that collected all of the sustainability efforts into one place where you could track your progress. You could see, if you were leading a manufacturing plant, what was most important to address first. And you could also start segmenting it into 3 different main areas, and you could allocate subject matter experts to actually start addressing the problems there and roll out the solutions. So it sort of became a strategic tool that was also an execution roadmap and also what to do next, sort of indexation, you could say.
Yeah, so they were in a situation where they had a goal, an ambitious climate strategy, but there was also an execution gap, and they needed a place to find out for each individual factory of this factory mass, where are we and what do we need to do to get where we want to be.
Yeah, and even what will good look like?
Yeah,
was a question they kept asking. Like, what will good look like if we're doing really well on waste? Yeah. What does that even look like? Because that, when you go out and you say we want to be net zero or we want to be part of the circular economy, quite often there's not a lot of house in that strategy. So at the end of the day, it's the person on the floor that has to figure out how to deliver on this sort of large, somehow intangible goal that can be really hard to translate into a production line. Yeah. So one of the things that we saw so maybe I should go into how we then figured out what to do first. So we started interviewing the directors for each of the sites. It's a place that has different production sites all over the world on different continents. So we needed to figure out what is the reality of the factory manager in each of these countries. How do they rate their own maturity on the different areas? How do they rate their staff, their competencies, their ongoing projects, and their systems, to figure out what's the maturity of the site in each of the areas. Then, knowing that, we would also learn what language do they use to describe the processes, to describe the different areas. So for instance, a factory in a very water-scarce area had initiated rainwater collection, which would normally, I would say, this indicates a very high level of maturity on water and water efficiency. But what it also showed was that this was an initiative that came out of a necessity, because they were really short on water. So they would need to have their own supply. So it was also a responsible strategy business-wise, because it made them more resilient. So they would, for instance, be very mature on water, but their own perception wasn't that they were that mature, because they were living in scarcity. So comparing that to another factory that was in an area that doesn't have water scarcity to the same degree, but was nearly as efficient in utilizing the water resource, they would see themselves as more efficient because it wasn't the same problem. So this kind of allowed us to get under the skin of how are they thinking, how are they talking about it, so we could develop this tool in accordance to how they talk about it themselves.
Yeah, it just goes back to a very key principle in all the work that we do, that we are the helpers and we need to make sure that the ownership is in the client organization, because they're the ones that's going to run with it and create the real change. And that's why we were in this project. I remember we were kind of pulled in as experts as well and tell us how to do, what to do, tell us what good look like. We also did definitely some of that, but it was also very, very important that the model and the plan was co-created with the people who are actually going for it. And all of that you just described is a way of doing that. And they did tremendous work. I was really amazed at how much effort they put in.
We recorded that one podcast episode on why transformations fail, especially why green transformations fail. And a very big part of that is that senior management or executive management fail to secure buy-in from bottom up. And co-creation is really great tool in sort of securing that buy-in, because everyone has contributed in the creation of the plan, of the model, of the tools and the tactics. So of course there's a higher likelihood that they'll also take part in the execution and the transformation project.
Yeah, it's more likely to reflect their reality rather than if you get some generic model. I think a really good example of it, that even the language or the metrics that are being used, stuff like, do we measure our waste in tons or in volume? If all your systems are set up to measure it in tons, and you get a plan where you say, yeah, but you have to reduce by this amount of volume, it's very easy to feel like, okay, this is something that's being dragged over my head and doesn't really reflect what is set up for us.
Yeah, and at the same time, it's also sort of showing what kind of sophistication do you have. If you know the tonnage of waste a site is producing, then you're more sophisticated than if you do not know the tonnage of waste. But if you know the euro value that this amount of waste represents, if you know which fractions do you have in which quantities and which qualities, then you're very sophisticated. So it was also a part of this model when we were looking at waste, we were also paving the way for them to become more and more sophisticated, but step by step. Not by saying the end goal is that you're going to have zero waste and you're going to reuse everything and all of it is going to be grown out of thin air. That wasn't the project. The project was, what is the current status? How do we go to the next level? And also at the same time showing the way to what is the path to the level after that. And quite often we see that as missing, because many transformation projects and many implementation projects, they only have the next step. So they don't look ahead. And
sometimes it makes sense to jump over. Could you perhaps just describe to our listeners, we had some focus areas in the model. What were the three focus areas?
So we developed three material areas that were, or important areas that were great categories to look at and also sort of isolate. So they didn't have too much spillover. So one is energy. How do we optimize energy consumption and energy purchases? Another was water. How do we optimize water consumption? And the third was waste. So looking at each of these areas, we defined different levels of maturity for a factory to run a self-assessment and figure out which level am I on at my factory and which initiatives do I need to start in order to get to the next level. So this was a great way for a site in the Americas to compare to a site in Europe.
So also about creating a uniform tool and language.
And also so they can learn from one another, right? So then each step on the way has a list of questions you can answer. And if you answer yes to all of the questions, you're on the right path, then you're on the next level. And then we sort of build the how-to for how to get to the next level. What do you need to do? What kind of staff do you need to recruit? What kind of budget do you need to allocate? What kind of timelines do you need to put
Which
in place?
Which competencies are missing? And so on. Could you, if we start with energy, could you, at a very high level, what are the key principles of being more mature in energy? What are the two most important things?
Energy is a funny area because there's only one thing that's really important, and that is, are you buying renewable energy?
Yeah.
Yes, no. And then
get that scope 2 down.
And then it gets a little bit more complicated because some things that you purchase energy for are very complex to deliver with renewable energy sources. For instance, if you're using steam in your production, it's usually if you have steam as an element in a production facility, you will need it to come hard and fast. So you're less likely to be able to deploy solar thermal, for instance, because you do need the sun to shine to some degree to do solar thermal, even though it can be quite cloudy and still deliver a lot of energy. So steam is an interesting case that's very hard to do without using fossil fuel.
Yeah. And in general, you can just say that for most pharma and medtech factory setups, many of them will be running on 3-team shifts 24/7. Breakdowns are really unacceptable because then at the end of the day, there's a patient who doesn't get their medicine or their device that they need. And usually the way the business models are put together is also such that it is not uncommon that either the production setup is set so that if it doesn't produce, you will lose a lot of money. But also if you are in growth areas, that might be the particular bottleneck. The bottleneck is not necessarily how much can we sell. If you can sell enough, the factory and the production system, and of course the whole supply chain around it actually becomes the bottleneck. But going back to energy, I think I completely agree with you that moving to renewable energy was absolutely so. I mean, at the lower levels, you'll have questions like, "Are you still using coal?" Or later up, I still. But I think one of the interesting things that we tried to introduce in the model as well was that also, are you actually trying to reduce the amount of energy that you spend? So one thing is using renewable energy, but there's still a finite amount of energy in the world. There's definitely a finite amount of energy that's renewable, and that's often forgotten in the scope 2, where we're made a power purchase agreement. It's all green. We can put a check mark, but are we actually also very drastically trying to reduce our energy, which is also where all the great business cases lie. So
that's a great point, that there's kind of two sides of it, right? There's on the purchasing side of things, then there's some technical limitations. Are we actually able to produce steam reliably with renewable energy? Right now that's complex, so it's a high-level task. But then on the other side, what kind of renewable energy are we purchasing? Are we using bundled certificates, for instance, or are we owning ourselves? Do we own the solar plant that produces our energy most of the time? So there's different degrees of sophistication here. And then, of course, are we spending wisely when we spend?
So are we actively running programs to reduce energy consumption?
Are we capturing heat on site and recirculating heat, recirculating cooling? These kind of things are potentially quite impactful in a lot of settings. Then there's something that I think surprises a lot of people when they hear about it, is that some manufacturing machinery gets quite hot. So you spend a lot of energy cooling it down, but you don't necessarily do it in the best way. And actually, just by changing the airflow in the factory, you make sure that the buildup of warm air around the machine is reduced because there's more airflow, and then you reduce the need for cooling. So sometimes there can also be very simple solutions, like having a very large fan in the ceiling can actually reduce your cooling needs, even though it doesn't reduce the air temperature that much, but it just increases the flow, so you don't build up that heating that provides overheating and becomes a problem.
So what this model allowed the factory leadership to was as well to say, okay, what are the core principles? What do I need to do to go to the next level? And have a structured conversation around that would then allow them to go, okay, so I need to fix this. What kind of solutions are there? Okay, I can go out and find bigger fans, or we maybe need a different way to make steam, or are we even purchasing our energy the right way? What are the key principles in the waste there?
Waste is a bit tricky because waste is really difficult. And where energy is very commoditized, you can buy renewable energy in the market. Waste is significantly less mature of a field. So the first thing you need to make sure is that in the circular economy, we're talking about things that enter the loop. So when we take raw materials from the planet and put it into the loop of the world, and then we take it out of the loop when we're disposing of it. And that would be sort of end game out of the loop would be we're producing a biogas from it. There's a waste product, but there's also a product, that's the gas. The gas goes back into the loop, then it becomes heat and it's out of the loop again. The waste product
just drop something in a landfill. That's a way of taking
and
it out.
The waste product would go to the landfill, or the product could go directly to the landfill, or the product could go to incineration.
Some listeners will have the picture of the El MacArthur butterfly on their mind. So that's complex.
Yeah, maybe we can have the butterfly model shown in the video as well right now. That would be insane. I'm looking at our producer right now.
A circular economy is about getting the most value from the resources we have by keeping them at their highest utility and value.
So essentially, waste is a bit more of a tricky beast. But first off, you could look at when we generate waste at our site, where does it go? And when we have figured out where it goes, have we optimized on where it's going? So landfill is the least desirable place for waste to end up.
Why is that? Just
simply because we have a limited amount of space where waste can go, and it's polluting to the local environments.
And we stop using the resource.
And we stop using the resource, so we become dependent on more extraction in the other end to get new raw materials into the loop.
So that's just like out in a field, dumping it, forgetting about it, placing it somewhere.
Basically. It can end up in the oceans, it can sort of bleed into the ecosystems. There's many bad things can happen from the landfill. And another thing is we can see that if there's, for one reason or another, the responsible ones lose their responsibility or their agency to be responsible for it, then we have a big old landfill full of waste lying in the middle of nowhere somewhere that no one is responsible for. So incineration is sort of the next tier.
So and burning the trash.
Yeah, so putting it into a large furnace, burning it, and then you can do one of two things in that process. You can burn it without energy recovery, so you just burn it, done, get over with it, or you can burn it with energy recovery. And this burning with energy recovery is a very proud tradition in Denmark. Because we
used to be celebrated a lot.
I think it still is actually. But the thing is, we have a really good district heating system in Denmark. So when we burn waste, we can actually turn it into something we would use fossil fuels to heat our homes. But instead, we use the burning of trash. So It's slightly better than landfill, but not a lot better, because we're still dependent on extracting raw materials and getting that into the loop. So when we're looking at that, there's a level above that, and that's recycling. So when we recycling is very different from reusing. And that's a very common mistake being made, that these are mistaken to be the same thing. When you recycle something, you take something that has been given shape, and you take the shape away from it, and you can turn it into something else.
So we take a wooden chair, we split it apart and use the wood
for cardboard.
Yeah.
That would be recycling. So we took a very high value material, then we broke it down and turned it into a low value material. Then there's a concept within recycling that we call upcycling, which would be to take the office chair, take it apart and turn it into an art piece that is done by Banksy, and then selling it at an art fair at a much higher value. So then you took something of comparatively low value and increased its market value. That would be an example of upcycling, but it can also be more commercial cases.
Making designer cutting boards or whatever.
There's a lot of cases there. So recycling is kind of the next step after incineration with energy recovery. Within recycling, there's a lot of different degrees of recycling.
Could you take first then what is reuse? Then we can go back to the...
So when we reuse, we take something that has been given shape, say the office chair, and after it's been used in the office, we take it somewhere else and we use it as a chair. In somebody's home or in a different office or in a church or something else.
Or something else, but we use it without spending energy on giving it...
we maintain the shape. So if you want to use the chair as a hat, of course that...
Lennager once, the Danish architectural firm, experts within circularity, they had created like for a festival or conference, then they had created chairs that could be put together to create temporary walls as well, like space separators. So that would be another way where it still has the shape and form. We're not breaking it down, but we're reusing it in a new way.
And you're not using it as a hat, which I think is a general advantage.
I've had a few parties where chairs ended up as hats. The key principles is in the waste for reaching higher levels is know where is waste and resources going when we stop using it. Putting it in landfills or burning it, that's bad. And then we basically enter into the Ellen MacArthur butterfly, and then the closer to the core you can come, the more you can reuse the waste without spending energy on giving it new form, the better. To sum up the waste category. Then we have water.
Water is a funny area. Most manufacturing plants, they take water in, then they use it, and then they release it. Either they treat it first as treated water, or they don't treat it and then it's untreated water. And that's of course that's the lowest level. So first of all, you need to know how much water you're using, where you're using it, what are you using it for, and then how are you getting rid of it again. Then the basic principles are, of course, again, sophistication. How much do you know, and how well are you using the resources? So are you taking water in and using it for the most high-level processes first, and then reusing the water on site, either once or twice or thrice or continuously? So the more times you can reuse the resource on site, the better, of course, because this does two things for you. It reduces the cost of buying the water in the first place. It also reduces your reliance on water access. And last but not least, it also reduces the cost that you have to cover when you're releasing the water into the ecosystem. So the less water you release, the less you have to pay to local governments. And the higher sort of degree of sophistication you have, the better you're able to use the resource, and the more resilience you will probably also have in your production line.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that in many areas already, fresh water, access to fresh water is a problem, and regulations are getting stricter and stricter. We've seen this in California, in South Africa, in India, many places. And as temperature is increasing, this is only going to get worse. And especially pharma production usually takes quite a bit of water.
Yeah, and there's a lot of environmental pollution that doesn't go out as greenhouse gases, so it's not measured in the CO2 accounting models, but it can have a very heavy burden on the local ecosystems. So we do see areas where sort of the chemical pollution from drug production or from drug consumption is having quite a heavy toll on the local ecosystems.
Yeah, especially on something like antibiotics. That's a real mess for a different episode. So I think one very interesting point I would like to discuss here at the end is that what was the client able to do with this plan that they were not able to do before? Because as most well-run companies, most companies will have some kind of a water strategy plan, some kind of waste strategy plan, some kind of energy.
And of course they had a lot of plans for all of it in place, and at some sites they had more plans than others, and some places they were complementary and such. So what was the picture before going in was that a lot of initiatives were going on, but it was not coordinated, it was quite fragmented. So after this project, after giving this concrete model, the efforts were sort of collected in one model. It was translated into the same language. It was comparable across countries and across sites. And it enabled them to have knowledge exchange to a much higher degree and comparability across sites. And also to identify the good business cases faster. So they were able to actually use this both as a strategic tool, as a concrete roadmap, but also as an educational tool, because they were able to look ahead much further. So I think one thing that we really saw to a very high degree was that the feedback was that we love that this is so concrete, that we know what we can go out and do. It's very tangible for us. And then of course, when you have a very high degree of maturity on one side, they would be likely to say, yeah, but now I'm all the way deep into selecting the ventilation unit, and all of a sudden I don't know if I'm supposed to pick the General Electric or the Siemens unit, where you'd say, okay, but that's a good problem. Because you know what you're doing and why. And now it's more to the how prioritization type questions, which is amazing to be at that level. So I would say, what's the difference before and after? Before it was fragmented, disconnected. Now it's collected and synchronized and
there were structured individual plans on water, and it's a very well-run company, but it wasn't put together. And the language wasn't uniform. And then one thing I absolutely loved about this project was just their level and ambition. They kept asking us, okay, so if we do this, will we be best in class? Will we be best? Is this what really circular looks like? And also now then we've done some follow-up, and we can see that in their assessments out there, they're being super harsh. In the individual levels, so that's also where one initial thought could have been, so I'm gonna try and do the minimum I can to get that check mark to go to the next level, and it's been quite the opposite.
Yeah, and I think it's, if we're going back to the sports metaphor, this is kind of being the coach of a team that really wants to win.
Yeah.
And and then it makes it more fun because they really want to be best. Yeah. And then if you have someone who's already best in class and they're asking you how can we be even more best in class, it's a fun challenge also to our professional skill set to figure out, okay, what would it look like 3 years from now when they have implemented all of this, because they're going to implement a lot of it very fast. What would be the next level, and kind of challenge our own idea and the limitations that we've seen in the market, because no one has done this before at that scale. So an interesting element to it is that what we see is really sort of a confrontation of this net zero idea that we need to go to zero emission, but that's actually not good enough. We need to be regenerative. So we build that into the model as well as sort of the North Star, that what we're aiming at is actually
at the end of the day, we need to give back more than we take.
Exactly,
not just,
exactly. We need to go into healing. We cannot just stop the bleeding. We need to heal. And that's, I think that was really inspiring learning to have there, that kind of showing that the North Star is out there, even though it's what we do. It's not what we do tomorrow, but the reason why we do what we do tomorrow is that we want to be able to head towards that North Star.
Definitely. And then just one final thing, which I thought was a really, really interesting side effect, is that in these discussions, in the work with the environmental leadership and the leadership at the factories, we also got a little bit more of a language for how this can be leveraged strategically and be specific business cases. So a lot of environmental teams are often cast in a role as sort of a sideshow dudes that are not viewed as a core part of the business.
And you're the Robin to the Batman.
Yeah, a really nice eureka moment with one of the directors where he was like, yeah, what I do is good business. And it was not just what came in this project, it was what they had already done. But just the knowledge and putting up a big chest to say, okay, the money I save, or the production reliability that I create by gathering rainwater or reusing, whatever it might be, that's worth just as much as another thing from what they do in the production line or in the supply chain or whatever. We can also be and should be a core part of the business and key in not just being an add-on, but driving better care and treatment, more reliability, more top line, more bottom line, and that was just amazing to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Fred. This was an amazing project, and one I hope we will do more similar of in the future, and I think so, because it's really needed.
It seems quite likely.
Yeah. Thanks for coming.
Cheers. Thanks for having me.
That was a really, really nice episode to do. It was an amazing project to do that created a lot of impact and business value. And if you're sitting in a similar situation, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can find our contact info at greeninnovationgroup.com. Thanks for listening, and keep on trucking with the sustainability out there. It's needed more than ever.